The brutal murder of a motel owner would set in motion a legal saga spanning nearly 3 decades, revealing deep flaws in the pursuit of justice and pushing one man to the brink of execution 9 separate times. On January 7, 1997, the body of Barry Van Treese, proprietor of the Best Budget Inn in Oklahoma City and Tulsa, was discovered within his Oklahoma City establishment. He had been savagely beaten to death with a baseball bat. This gruesome act marked the beginning of a complex case that would eventually reach the highest court in the land, not once, but twice, challenging the very foundations of due process and capital punishment in America. The initial investigation quickly narrowed its focus, but the path to truth would prove anything but straightforward. Barry Van Treese, a businessman owning 2 Best Budget Inn motels, was a familiar figure in Oklahoma City. His manager at the time was Richard Eugene Glossip, born February 9, 1963, then 33 years old. Also residing and working at the motel as a handyman was Justin Sneed, a 19-year-old with a known methamphetamine addiction and a history of violent crime. Sneed lived rent-free at the motel, a circumstance that put him in close proximity to both the victim and the alleged mastermind. The relationship between these 3 men at the Best Budget Inn would become the central, and ultimately most contentious, element of the ensuing criminal investigation and subsequent trials. The early hours following the discovery of Van Treese's body saw police quickly apprehending both Glossip and Sneed. During police interrogation, Justin Sneed initially offered no direct information implicating anyone else in Van Treese's murder. However, detectives, acutely aware of Sneed's presence at the crime scene and his physical injuries, reportedly pressed him with a stark choice: implicate an accomplice, or risk holding the bag for first-degree murder, which could lead to his own execution. It was only after detectives specifically introduced Richard Glossip's name that Sneed's story began to change. Under this immense pressure, Sneed eventually confessed to the brutal beating of Barry Van Treese. His confession, however, came with a critical caveat that would shape the entire course of Glossip's legal battle. Justin Sneed, facing the prospect of the death penalty for the murder of Barry Van Treese, struck a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for pleading guilty to murder and testifying against Richard Glossip, Sneed would receive a life sentence without parole, effectively saving himself from execution. Sneed's testimony became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. He claimed Glossip had commissioned him to kill Van Treese for $10,000, an alleged murder-for-hire scheme. Richard Glossip, however, steadfastly maintained his innocence, refusing any plea bargain that would have required him to admit guilt in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. This decision cemented his fate for years to come, leading to a trial where his life literally hung in the balance. In July 1998, an Oklahoma jury convicted Richard Glossip of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. The core of this conviction rested almost entirely on Justin Sneed's testimony, with little to no corroborating physical evidence directly linking Glossip to orchestrating the crime. The jury found the aggravating circumstance that Glossip committed the murder for remuneration or employed another to do so. However, just 3 years later, on July 17, 2001, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals, or OCCA, overturned Glossip's conviction. The court cited ineffective assistance of counsel, specifically pointing to the defense's failure to adequately challenge Sneed's inconsistent statements and a video potentially showing police coercion. This ruling granted Glossip a new trial, but his ordeal was far from over. Richard Glossip's legal battle continued with a retrial. In 2004, he was once again convicted of first-degree murder and, for the second time, sentenced to death. Despite the previous ruling by the OCCA, the prosecution again relied heavily on Justin Sneed's testimony. The OCCA later affirmed this second conviction, asserting that circumstantial evidence, including Glossip's alleged mismanagement of the motel and initial dishonesty with police about Sneed's injuries, corroborated Sneed's account. This second conviction locked Glossip into a decades-long struggle on death row, facing multiple execution dates, each a terrifying countdown to a fate he continuously denied was deserved. The path forward would lead to an unexpected challenge against the very method of his potential execution. As Richard Glossip awaited execution, he joined other Oklahoma death row inmates in a landmark Supreme Court case, Glossip v. Gross, heard on April 29, 2015.
The petitioners challenged Oklahoma's use of midazolam as the first drug in its three-drug lethal injection protocol.
They argued that midazolam, an anesthetic, could not reliably render a prisoner unconscious, thus violating the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment by exposing them to severe pain.
Attorneys like Dale Bake argued that prisoners should not be required to identify an alternative method.
On June 29, 2015, the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, upheld Oklahoma's protocol. The court ruled that the petitioners failed to prove a substantial risk of severe pain or identify a known and available alternative method of execution. Justices Breyer and Ginsburg, however, issued powerful dissents, questioning the constitutionality of the death penalty itself, citing issues of unreliability and arbitrariness. This decision cleared the way for Oklahoma executions, but the case of Richard Glossip was far from settled.
Despite the Supreme Court's ruling on lethal injection, doubts about Richard Glossip's guilt persisted and intensified. In 2022, a bipartisan group of 62 Oklahoma legislators commissioned an independent investigation by the law firm Reed Smith.
Their findings were alarming. The investigation reported grave doubt about Glossip's conviction and, critically, revealed that key physical evidence had been destroyed before his second trial.
This revelation, coupled with newly unearthed prosecutorial misconduct, began to shift the state's official stance.
This growing body of evidence would eventually lead to an unprecedented move by Oklahoma's top prosecutor, signaling a turning point in Glossip's long struggle.
The independent review, and subsequent disclosures, revealed critical Brady and NAPU violations by the prosecution in Glossip's case. Prosecutors had withheld evidence that Justin Sneed, their star witness, was under psychiatric care, diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and prescribed lithium. Sneed falsely denied this at trial, and the prosecution failed to correct his perjured testimony. Even more damning, a memorandum surfaced that appeared to show the state coaching Sneed to change material aspects of his testimony. There was also corroboration from Sneed's own legal counsel, indicating his desire to recant his original testimony. These revelations painted a damning picture of a conviction built on compromised evidence and prosecutorial misconduct, setting the stage for another Supreme Court intervention. In an extraordinary turn of events, Oklahoma's Attorney General, Gentner Drummond, who took office in 2023, concluded after his own independent review that he could not stand behind the murder conviction and death sentence of Richard Glossip. He filed a motion with the U.S. Supreme Court, urging them to vacate Glossip's conviction. The Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, Glossip v. Oklahoma, on January 22, 2024. During the oral arguments on October 9, 2024, former U.S. Solicitor General Seth Waxman argued for Glossip, while former Solicitor General Paul Clement supported Glossip's arguments, a rare alignment. Justice Neil Gorsuch notably recused himself due to prior involvement. The weight of the state's own top legal officer joining the defense underscored the profound doubts surrounding Glossip's guilt and the integrity of his conviction. On February 25, 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered a landmark 5-3 decision in Glossip v. Oklahoma. The court reversed the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals judgment, holding that the prosecution had indeed violated Glossip's constitutional due process rights. The majority opinion, delivered by Justice Sonia Sotomayor and joined by Chief Justice John Roberts and Justices Kagan, Kavanaugh, and Jackson, specifically cited the prosecution's failure to correct Justin Sneed's false testimony regarding his mental health diagnosis and lithium prescription. This critical evidence, the court determined, could have significantly affected the jury's judgment. The ruling vacated Glossip's conviction and ordered a new trial, a stunning victory nearly 3 decades in the making. Following the Supreme Court's decision, Oklahoma Attorney General Gentner Drummond announced on June 9, 2025, that his office would retry Richard Glossip for first-degree murder, but notably, would not seek the death penalty. After nearly 3 decades of incarceration, facing execution 9 times, Richard Glossip was granted bond. On May 14, 2026, Oklahoma County District Judge Natalie Mai set his bond at $500,000, with conditions including electronic monitoring, a curfew, and travel restrictions. Glossip, then 63 years old,
walked free that same day, stepping out of prison into a world vastly changed since 1997. A new murder trial is now set to begin in September 2026, where Glossip will once again face charges, but this time, without the shadow of the death penalty.
The case of Richard Glossip has left an indelible mark on America's legal landscape.
Glossip v. Gross in 2015, while upholding lethal injection protocols, fueled a renewed national debate on the constitutionality of the death penalty itself, particularly through Justice Breyer's powerful dissent. Then, Glossip v. Oklahoma in 2025 reinforced the critical importance of Brady and Napoo precedents, demanding prosecutorial transparency and accountability. Glossip's journey, from multiple death sentences to eventual release on bond awaiting a new trial, has become a potent symbol of the potential for wrongful convictions, the fragility of justice when dependent on uncorroborated testimony, and the enduring fight for due process. His case continues to ignite conversations about reforming capital punishment and ensuring integrity within the American justice system, particularly in states like Oklahoma, which has a prolific history of executions.